Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be setting up some logging utilities in our API project. Now, when I say logging, I mean we're going to be setting up functionality so that we can pretty much write down or set up a mechanism by which we can write down whatever actions we deem important in our application. So the important thing about logging in, especially in an API, is that it helps you to debug. It helps you to track exactly what action happened and where. So to accomplish this, we're going to be using NLog, and there are other libraries that, are good. I use Log4net also, but in this video, for this purpose, we're going to be using NLog. So to get started, we're going to go over to NuGet. So I'm going to right click the project, go to manage NuGet packages. Then we're going to browse and we're going to look for N, that's the letter N, L-O-G, NLog. Now, there are a number of them here, but the one that we are really interested in is nlog.extensions.logging. All right. So we're going to click that one, download it into our project. And once that's done, we can always just go over to installed and verify that it's there, removing the filter and showing everything that is in our project, courtesy of NuGet. All right. Next up, we want to set up a config file. So I already set up this config file. You can find it in the resources for this project. So you can actually just go ahead and copy it and create a file called nlog.config. So to create a file, you just right click the project, go to add, and then new item. And really and truly, it doesn't matter which one. I just use a text file, but it must have the .config extension. All right. So you can use a text file and just say nlog.config as the name. And then you can just paste the contents in. I'm not going to spend time writing it with you, but I will explain what is in the file. So the file is basically just initializing nlog XML. It's an XML configuration file for NLog. So it's just doing some initialization, setting the schema that it should use, some basic initializers. And then we have the path. So the internal log file path, I'm setting it to some path on my machine. All right. So you can change this. So the easiest thing maybe for you so that you can see where your logs go is just to put it on your main drive, / and probably create a folder called logs. So I'm just going to make that change here. So it's C/log. So C:/logs, internal log. And then for the file name, so we have target log file. So the target log file, meaning where should all the logs go, right? So we're going to say file name, and then you can put in a path, once again, maybe to your project folder or to somewhere that is very easy to find, right? And then the layout here is basically saying, how do you want me to name this file? So, this is actually saying, how do you want me to name the file? So the short date : log file. So for each day that you carry out actions, it will look at the date and generate a new file, right? So it makes it easier to track what happened yesterday versus last week versus today specifically. And then the layout would be, how should each line look? So you're going to have the long date, the level, meaning was it an error info? You still see that level stuff. And then you're going to have the actual message relating to that line. All right. So that is what that is. And some rules, as in the minimum level and maximum level and so on. But I think this is good enough for us to proceed. So I'm going to save that. Once again, this is included with the video, so you can go ahead and fetch it if you wish. All right. So next up, we need to configure two classes and configure our startup. So we can just do a quick build, Ctrl+Shift+B, just to make sure we didn't introduce any errors to break our program. And it was successful, so we can proceed. So I'm going to add two folders to my project. So I'm going to right click and click add and new folder. And then the first one is going to be contracts. And then the second one, so I'm going to go there again, right click, add new folder. And this one is going to be services. All right. So under contracts, I'm going to create a class file. So I'm going to right click again, click add class. And then I'm going to call this one iLogger service. And then on the services, I'm going to do the same thing, create a class, and I'm going to call this one logger service. So one is logger service, that's under the services folder, and the other one is iLogger service under the contracts folder. Now under iLogger services, or iLogger service, sorry, we're going to create some, this one is going to be an interface. So the general naming convention for interfaces is that you put an I at the front of the name, right? So public interface, not class, but interface. So it's easier to just create the class and then change it to interface, but just make sure you don't miss that step. All right. So inside the interface, we're going to have void log info. And then this function is going to take a parameter of type string, and we'll call it message. All right. So we have log info string message. And then the thing is that there are basically a few types of things that we'll want to log, maybe info, warnings, debug messages, and definitely errors. We want to see errors. So we have one function for log info, and then we're just going to create 3 other functions for warn. So I just duplicated that. I just use Control and D. So by selecting the line, you just do Control and D and it duplicates that line, right? So I have log info, log warn, and then I'm going to have log debug and then log error. All right. So I have these 4 functions that will be handling logging, and based on how it's going to be configured, each one is going to appear differently, slightly differently inside of the log file. All right. So it would be easier for us to see all the errors and cut through the noise of info. Maybe warnings would be less useful, and definitely we don't need debug under certain situations. So that is it for our contract. So I can just save that and then go over to the service. Now the service is going to have the definitions for those functions we just outlined in the interface. So I'm going to do colon iLogger service. All right. So this is what we call inheritance. So the class is going to be inheriting from the interface. And then because of that, it's going to say I need to include some missing stuff. So I'm just going to use the light bulb, put in the using statement, and then further to that, it's going to tell me that I haven't implemented. So I have to now go ahead and implement the interface. So now I get the function definitions per function that was declared in the contract file. Now, after doing that, I need an element, so a property pretty much. So I'm going to have private static, and then this is going to be of type iLogger. Now iLogger is a part of the NLog library, so I have to include, see there, using NLog. So they have their own logging, sure, but I'm using NLog. So I want to make sure I'm using NLog, right? iLogger, logger, and then that's going to be equal to log manager. So I'm initializing my logger object, and I'm going to use get current class logger. All right. So now that I have this line in, I can call on this object, or this, let's call it an object. So I can call on this object now to carry out my logging. So let's start off with log debug. Right now it's just throwing a not implemented. I'm implementing it. So I'm going to say when I call the log debug function, then I want my logger to create a debug message. See that? And then what it will send over is the message that I have passed into the function. All right. And that's pretty much it. So log error is going to do the same thing. I'm calling my logger object dot error. All right. And then of course, I'm the one controlling what messages are really being passed in. So if it's an error, then I must make sure I pass in the error message so that when I check the logs, I see the error that was thrown. All right, so by now, I'm sure you got the hang of it. If you didn't, you can pause the video and write them off. But I'm hoping that you already paused the video and finished up the other two, hoping that you wrote the same thing I was going to write, and we're both correct. And if you wrote logger.info for log info and logger.warn for warn, then we're all on the same page. Now we have one more change to make, and that is to the startup.cs. So we have to add that component to our middleware configurations. And remember, order matters. Always just save the controllers line for last. So anything else you're adding, just add it above, right? So for NLog, or for the logger service to be initialized into our application at startup, I'm going to say services dot add singleton. So you can now add the service into the whole middleware and into the startup of the application by adding either singleton or add transient or add scoped. So, I mean, we're using singleton. So I'm just going to say add singleton, logger service. And I'll explain the difference between the singleton and the scoped and the transient later on. I just don't want to overwhelm you with information just yet. So what we're doing is saying that we want to create a singleton instance of the service. And this is our service really, or this is our contract for the service. And this is the implementation of the contract. So anything that's missing, you just hover over it and include the library accordingly till you see no green lines. And with that, we would have set up NLog in our application, in our entire .NET Core application, and made it ready for use. Now that we've set up NLog, we need to test it, right? So the real test would be to try something or to put in a line of code that should create a log and then verify that the log was indeed created. So I'm going to go over to my controller, and what we're going to do is put in some lines in, or maybe two of our actions, just to say when we hit the action, that it should write the log that the action was hit. So to get started, what we need to do is perform this thing called the dependency injection, where our service is going to be injected into the controller so the controller can interact with our NLog service, right? So we reference our service through the contract. So I'm going to say private, and I'm going to call it read only. And I say logger service, right? So that's the name of my contract that I created. And I can just go ahead and either use Alt Enter or just click on the light bulb to include any missing dependency, and then underscore logger. So that's the name of my object that is going to embody the service that is logging. But then for dependency injection, we need to declare inside of our controller our constructor, right? So I'm going to say public home controller. So a constructor is a default function that gets called once a class is initialized, right? So I'm going to say, once you call the home controller, I want you to initialize the iLogger service. So I'm going to just pass in the iLogger service, and then the parameter is iLogger. So the cool thing about .NET Core, if you used to do dependency injection in previous versions of MVC, you would need third-party tools like Ninject or something like that. But MVC makes it, .NET Core makes it very easy to just dependency inject, because it comes basically built in, and this whole ecosystem surrounds dependency injection. So that reduces some abstractions, some duplications, and doing things more than once. It reduces the need for some of that. So I'm just going to initialize our read-only object underscore logger to the object logger that is going to be passed in when our home controller is called. Now that I have my object initialized, I can now interact with the service. So if I wanted to log something, I could say underscore logger dot, and then I have access to all of my functions that I just declared. So I would want to maybe do an info and say accessed home controller. All right. So I'm going to say in the log that you access the home controller, and I'm going to try and do a different one. So I'm just copying that, and then under the get, let's say I log debug instead. Right, and then I'm going to say got a value, and then on the post, let me just paste, and then I'm going to log an error this time. So when it's post, I'm going to say this is an error, something like that. And the last one under, let's try delete. I was going to get a bit complicated, but that's fine. We can get that later on. So this one is going to be a warning. This is a warning. All right. And this is going to be log warn. So I've outfitted all of these functions, or actions rather, with logging functionality. So let's try. So I'm going to go into debug mode, and I'm also going to launch Postman. So if you have already installed it, or even if you haven't, then you can go ahead and install it and launch it. All right, so we're going to put in our first API call. So I just copied the URL from our debug session. So that's localhost :44. Well, my port is going to be different from yours. So whatever this base URL is, and then in Postman, I said that URL /API/home. So that's the name of my controller. My API is now situated at home. And when I do that, I went straight to the get, right? If I do home /5, then send, it sends it to value. Okay, so that's sorry. So let me just show you what's happening. So when I went to home, it went to this one. So the expectation is that in the log file, I'm going to see this getting logged before the result came back, right? The same for get. We would see a debug, and I spelled value wrongly. Sorry about that. All right, got a value, return the value, and then let's just do a post. So to do a post, all this time we've been doing get. So I'm just going to remove that value, and I just have to change this request type to post and then send. All right, let me backtrack a little. I was going a bit too quickly. All right, so back in our controller, we have our post. Do we get there through API/home? So that's what we have. It's a post method, so we are not using get, but we're using post. All right, but then it is expecting some value from the body, right? So that means using Postman, we have to put in some text or some value in the body. So if you click that body tag, so up here, you'll see params, authorization, headers, and body, right? And then the default one selected is none. So we have to go over to raw, right? So you have different ways to submit data into the body of the request being sent, right? So we're going to select raw, and then we're leaving it as JSON. So you may see text. JSON is what we want, right? So if you see text, you just click it and you see JSON in the list. And then we're just going to type in a string, and we're going to say test value, all right? And then when we send, let's see if that one works. All right, so we don't see anything coming back because, well, it's not returning anything, but we are seeing a status okay, right? I could even modify this that it could return something else, but that's not really what we're here for. We tested the post and it went through. And then the final one would be, the other one that we want to test would be the delete. So if you look at the guideline as to how to get to it, you see API / and this is once again why documentation is so important. So it's API / API with action /5. All right. So let us try that one together. So this time we're doing a delete. So the request type is not post, it's not get, but it's delete, right? And I'm expected to pass in a value. So I'm going to say 5. I don't need a body, so I'm going to say from none. And the reason I know I don't need a body is that if you look at the post, I also look at put, you'll see from body. So that means it's expecting the value from the body, right? I'm sorry, I have this bad habit. I have a heavy hand when it comes to pressing the shift. Anyway, so let's try the delete. So I just changed that to delete, API / and it says API with action /5. So let me send. And then it replied okay. So that means it hit And if you're not sure, you can always put a breakpoint on the action. Because I made a modification, the breakpoint won't work. I'll have to restart. But you can always just put a breakpoint on a line of the action, and then just make sure it hit the right one. You may click send. It will pause for debug, and you know you're at the right place. Anyhow, I just tested all of the actions in which we put logger code. So what I'm going to do is find that path. So I forgot the path. My path is c/project/bookstore API/project/log. So I'm going to just copy all of that, bring up my Explorer window, and I'm going to navigate to it. And here I am. So I navigated to the file path on my system, and I see the file newly created. So if I right click and let's say open with Notepad++, then I'm going to see lines per request that I sent. So firstly, you can notice that it has in the date, it has in the timestamp, and it has in the type of log line or the level, right? So we know all the infos, we know all of the errors, we know all of the warnings, right? So it helps us to narrow down whether it was just that general information, or it was an error that occurred, or if it's just a warning. Of course, we're the ones who are determining which one gets written where in the code. So as a developer, you will be able to know that when this happens, put it down as a warning. When this one happens, put it down as an error. So if somebody calls in and says, they experienced this difficulty at this time on this day, you can find the file, find the timestamp, and find out what error may have occurred that contributed to that user's experience. So that is how we set up logging in our API, and that is why it is relevant to our application. And, you can review it. Once again, this is included with the resources for the video. So that is the XML configuration file. And you can go ahead and set up all the other stuff for logging.